Now that we've installed all the components that we're going to need for PHP development, specifically a web server, PHP, MySQL, a web browser, and a text editor, we're ready to get started with our first steps in writing PHP. The first thing we want to do is make sure that our web server is up and running successfully, and you'll want to turn it on if it's not already. We talked about how to do that during the installation chapter, but we can test it by launching a web browser. I'm going to launch Firefox, and we can go to http://localhost. Now, if you're on a Windows machine, this will tell the web server to bring up your personal web files. If you're on a Mac, though, you're going to need to also specify your user directory, which is going to be with a tilde and then your username after it. Mine is just Kevin. So by typing in localhost/Kevin, we're going to get the same thing that the Windows users are getting just by typing localhost. And this, on the Mac, you'll see it goes ahead and translates localhost into something different. Don't let that worry you. Either one will work the same. They're completely synonymous. But when I say localhost, that's what I'm talking about on the Mac. Now, we see we have a personal website here. Yours probably looks different if you're on a Windows machine. But we know that our web server is up and running, and it's serving files successfully. It's pulling files off of our hard drive, processing them, and sending them to our web browser. If you're not seeing this page, then you need to make sure that your web server is running and troubleshoot the problems with it. So where do these files live? I'm going to option-click on the desktop to hide Firefox, and I'm going to go to where those files live on my Mac. And we can do that by opening up our hard drive, clicking on our user folder, and going inside Sites. Now, if you're on a Windows machine, you remember when we installed WAMP, we put it on the C drive inside the WAMP directory inside www, and that's going to be your Sites directory. In both cases, regardless of which setup you have, or whether you've specified something different, the key thing here is to locate the place where Apache is going to be pulling files to serve to your web browser. If you're a Mac user, you'll probably have a folder here called phpMyAdmin because we installed phpMyAdmin into our Sites directory. If you're a Windows user, that was installed somewhere else for you. Don't let it throw you. We'll work with phpMyAdmin much later. But for now, we want to create another folder that we can start to put some of these beginning files into. And I'm going to do that by choosing File, New Folder from the File menu, and then type here php_sandbox. And that's going to be the name of the folder where we're going to do these introductory lessons. Now, when I'm developing, I actually like to have a sandbox type structure off to the side, separate from my project, where I can try things out. And that way, if I'm wondering if something's going to work, I can just drag files over to the sandbox or create new ones, try something out and do some experimenting without worrying that it's going to damage my project. So it's a good habit to go ahead and get into. And because I'm going to be using this sandbox a lot, I'm going to create an alias on the desktop. And I can do that a couple of different ways. I'm going to go ahead and just go to the File menu after selecting it and choose Make Alias. Now, an alias is the same thing as a shortcut in Windows. I'm just going to drag my alias to the desktop. There we go. Get it here where I can see it. And if you're on a Windows machine, you can do that by right-clicking, dragging the file to the desktop, and then choosing Make Shortcut. So once we have that, we'll be able to quickly get into our sandbox. So now that we have a place to put our files, let's start creating our first one. You want to open up your text editor. I'm using TextMate, and I made a link to it down here. And I put an alias for it down in the dock. Now that it's launched, I'm going to go ahead and just save this as a blank file without putting anything in it. I'm just going to File menu and choose Save. And I'm going to see it wants to put it in my sandbox right here. You may have to navigate down to it. You can do that just by clicking on the desktop and then PHP sandbox alias. And then I'm going to call the file, instead of txt, we're going to call it PHP. Remember, that's how we let the web server know that it's not an HTML file, it's not a text file. It's going to be a file that has PHP in it and requires PHP processing. And then I'm going to give the file a name. And for now, I'm just going to call it my_phpinfo. And that's going to be the name of this file. And we'll just save it. And sure enough, I'll go ahead and close this window back here, and we can get to our sandbox directly now from our link, and you'll see that the file is created. Now, this file won't do anything because it doesn't have any PHP in it. So let's write our first bit of PHP code. So this is what I want you to type into that window. It's going to be the less than sign, question mark, PHP with a space, phpinfo, open parentheses, close parentheses, semicolon, space, question mark, greater than sign. And that's going to become very familiar to us as we start working with PHP code. And we'll talk about what all the parts do. But for now, go ahead and just put that into that file and save it out. You'll see that I've typed it in my window, and I'm going to make sure that I save that file. You'll always want to make sure that you save it. Now, we won't need to restart our web server or anything like that. It's going to dynamically pull the new contents of this file as long as we've saved it, and it's going to send that to our web browser. So let's look at this file in our web browser now. We'll switch back to the web browser, and inside my sites directory, I'm going to add php_sandbox, and then a slash, and that's going to tell it to go into that PHP sandbox folder that I created. And then inside there, the file my_phpinfo.php. So that's going to tell it the full path to get to that file. And you'll see that it comes up with information about PHP. That one little function is a very special PHP function that returns all sorts of information about PHP as you have it installed on your system. So this is a great resource for you to know that PHP is running and to see what the configuration is. And I think probably every single PHP developer out there uses this as a quick and easy test to make sure that PHP is running successfully on a machine before they start trying to do a lot of other things. Now, because this file does give away a lot of information about your web server and PHP and the setup you have, you're never going to want to put this out on a web server where someone can find it. But for development purposes, it's going to be very useful. So scroll down, get used to the contents of what's in here. The key things that we want to check for right now, I'm going to skip down till I get to this section called PHP Core. And I'm going to look for this area here that's display errors. And you want to make sure that display errors is turned on. We did that during the configuration. This will make sure that we're able to see the errors that come back to us. If we were putting this in production and we were putting it out for the general world, we wouldn't necessarily want those errors to display to the general public. But for us, it's going to be good. Now, we talked about earlier that if you wanted to change that value, you would do it in the php.ini file, and we learned how to locate that when we were configuring PHP. That's the only time we're going to need to restart the web server with PHP, is if we make a change to the configuration of PHP itself. Once PHP has been loaded when the web server starts, we're not going to need to restart it at all. Remember, this is not a compiled language or anything like that. It's a scripting language. So it's going to be able to run our scripts straight out of the web pages. So now that we've successfully written our very first PHP page, let's talk a little bit about that, what we typed in there and what it means, and start to actually developing things that are more useful for our purposes.